In the autumn of 1873, amid the shadows of Milwaukee's German Quarter, the air felt heavier than usual. A damp wind crawled through narrow cobblestone streets, past gas lamps flickering uncertainly in the dusk. Behind lace-curtained windows, whispers stirred, the kind that ride just beneath a breath, careful not to be heard, but impossible to ignore. And at the center of those whispers was a girl, quiet, pale, rarely seen. Her name was Emma Richter. The Richter household was modest, nestled between a shuttered bakery and a watchmaker's shop whose bell hadn't rung in months. Emma lived there with her parents, German immigrants, who spoke little English and even less about their daughter. They kept to themselves, but neighbors had long noted something unusual: odd smells, fleeting sounds, and Emma herself occasionally glimpsed at the window with a distant expression, as if watching something no one else could see. She didn't speak until she was 7, and even then, it was often in fractured, archaic German that even her parents struggled to understand. Her skin bore peculiar patterns, lace-like markings that seemed to shift with her mood. Physicians, when they finally examined her, said she had an unnatural resistance to heat, reporting she never flinched around open flames, and often stared into them as if mesmerized. One claimed she blinked less than normal, and another noted how her body temperature never aligned with any known average. By 13, her presence unnerved even the local priest, who described her eyes as unsuitable for a child. She drew in stray animals without a word, and once was found in a circle of birds, silent, none frightened. It wasn't witchcraft, they said, and yet no one had another name for it. No photograph of Emma exists, only conflicting descriptions and a handful of journal entries from local officials who struggled to categorize her condition. Science offered no diagnosis. Religion offered no solace. And so Emma Richter became folklore, a tale told quietly after dark. Not for entertainment, but for warning. The city moved on. Streets changed. The bakery reopened. But the story of the girl who didn't fit in, who defied explanation and lingered in the minds of those who saw her, never quite vanished. Emma remained, if only in memory, among the shadows she once inhabited. By late October, the German Quarter learned to live with a peculiar hush. It wasn't silence, not precisely, but the careful padding of shoes over cobbles. The way conversation folded itself smaller when passing a certain stretch of houses. The bakery at the corner had reopened, and its morning steam carried spice into the alleyways, yet even bread could not sweeten that particular block. There, the soot collected more stubbornly. There, the gas lamps shivered, even when the night lay still, and in the middle of that stilled breath stood a narrow house with a pale door that never banged shut, no matter the wind. People said the hinges refused to complain out of respect, as if the wood itself had learned caution. Inside lived a girl whom the neighbors tried not to name unless they had to. They spoke of her in descents first, the eyebrows lowering, then the voice dropping, then the eyes cutting toward the lace-curtained windows. At market, in bakeries, on church steps, a girl who didn't catch colds and didn't sweat in summer, whose hands warmed cups from the outside. The sort of facts you pretend to have overheard, not discovered. People prefer mysteries that have arrived fully assembled. Her mother kept the window plants alive and overwhelmed. The leaves clung to the panes like a congregation at a door nobody opens. There were days the house smelled faintly of iron, like a penny held too long in the mouth. There were nights when the air thinned near the stairwell, and even the cat refused to pass the 4th step. On those nights, the girl lay awake, watching the lamplight swing across her ceiling in a small amber arc, counting the spaces between the creaks. She studied absence the way other children studied maps. Most of the city knew her only in glimpses, a profile at twilight, a white sleeve passing behind embroidered curtains, the ghost of a child's silhouette, too still for play. A butcher swore he'd seen her stand in the snow without hat or scarf, the steam of her breath trailing not into the air, but back toward her parted lips, curling inward, like a ribbon pulled by a hidden hand. He held his palm over a pot of broth, and told anyone who'd listen, "It is a trick of light." Then later, when he walked past the pale door, he changed the side of the street he walked on. There were explanations, of course. Milwaukee is a city that tries to accommodate its oddities by naming them. Nerves, nervous fevers, poor air, the aftertaste of war lingering in the immigrant quarters. This is how people phrased it. The rumor that her father had once been a Cooper-turned-winter watchman was neither here nor there, except that someone remembered he didn't shiver when the bell tower rang midnight, even bareheaded. People assign the habits of flame to families that keep their curtains drawn. On Sunday mornings, when the bells at St. Mary's stitched themselves through the sky, the girl watched processions from behind the lace. She did not envy the hats or the gloves or the small keyed purses, but she envied one thing: the ease with which people stepped into a story they believed would hold. She had never felt held by anything that way. Not by the bed frame whose slats whispered under her, not by the shawl her mother placed over her shoulders, not by prayer, which she had tried like a door latch that didn't catch. The first doctor who came to the house had a mustache and a habit of flattening his notes with the side of his hand. He spoke gently, as men do when they have already decided that their gentleness is the cure. Her mother made coffee so strong it stained the cups, and her father sat with his hat in his lap, turning it by the brim. The doctor asked simple questions, which the father answered in a German that had learned English at the edges, and the mother corrected quietly, and the girl said nothing. When the stethoscope touched her chest, it was cooler than her skin. The doctor paused. He listened longer than a heartbeat warrants. Later, he suggested more light, more fresh air, more meat. That was his way of saying the city had failed her, and he would not. The second doctor did not sit. He moved through rooms as if measuring them without tools. He sniffed the corners. He ran a finger along the mantel and checked it for dust. He took the girl's pulse and glanced toward the kitchen, where water simmered on the stove, as if the sound unusual rhythms made in the pot might tell him something. He said the word endocrine, as if that settled anything. He left with a barked warning about drafts, which was odd, because the house had none. There were small events, small until they were not. A teacup that warmed in her hands, to the point that the glaze faintly crazed, blistered, her mother said later, though the cup did not break. A candle whose flame leaned toward the girl when she entered, then straightened when she stepped away. A thin fog that sometimes slid along the edge of the parlor carpet and would not cross into the hall. The baker's boy claimed he felt a pocket-sized heat pass through him when he carried a loaf to the door, as if some breath had chosen him briefly and then moved on. Boys say things for sport, but he did not grin when he told it. The priest came once. He had kind eyes and a book that looked too heavy for human hands, and a habit of rubbing his thumb along the spine as if coaxing it to be lighter. He sat with the girl's parents first, then asked to see her. She stood at the threshold and did not step into the parlor until he did. He spoke to her as one speaks to a skittish horselow, steady, unafraid. He asked whether she slept, whether she dreamed. He asked whether her dreams stayed where they belonged. She surprised herself by answering, because she had not meant to, and because she answered in a German that had no business being in her mouth, the old kind that tastes like cellar air and old books. The priest's eyes did not widen. He only nodded, as if someone had told him in advance to expect a borrowed tongue. Outside, winter lengthened into a brittle thing. Men knocked ice from the stoops with iron tools until sparks leaped. Women's skirts whisked along the edges of frozen puddles with a sound like paper being turned in the dark. The girl's mother added quilts to the bed and found them on the floor by morning, the edges unburned, the center faintly warm, as if they had been lifted by a heat barely strong enough to make itself known. A neighbor swore the house gave off a warmer breath than the others. When the wind sank into the alley and pushed back, the pale door exhaled gently, fogging the air. The neighbor kept this to herself, because a city can forgive an oddity more easily than a neighbor who catalogs it. The girl's father, who was a practical man, began to place iron in quiet places, a horseshoe above the kitchen lintel, a nail under each bedpost, a key hung on a ribbon from a cupboard knob. He did not believe in charms, but he believed in doing something, and iron is a language even those who do not speak it have heard in the bones. The cat slept on the windowsill and woke sometimes with a twitch, as if a dream had moved past it too close and disturbed the fur. Once, in the middle of the night, the girl opened her eyes to find the cat staring back at her, its pupils wide as buttons. In the quiet, she could hear her mother's breath, and her father's, and something else, a low, almost musical whine from within the wall, as if the pipes had learned a note. Other children formed games around the house. They would skip past, daring one another to look up at the window. They counted how many steps their courage lasted. They gave the girl a name. She didn't know: the oven, which was cruel, or the lantern, which was kinder. Boys threw stones and then ran and told their mothers they had been chased, which they had not. The mothers told them not to be foolish. Still, when the boys slept, they dreamed of the pale door opening to reveal a room in which the air lay thick and bright and unforgiving, like air near a kill. Occasionally, the girl ventured into the yard. It was fenced and private and overlooked by windows that preferred not to notice. She would stand with her palms against the brick, feeling where the sun had left its memory and where shade had kept the heat for itself. Once, she pressed her ear to the wall and listened to nothing for so long that when a cart rattled by she flinched. The brick pressed a rough geometry into her cheek, and she smiled because it was, for an instant, proof of contact. Proof that she pushed against a world that could push back. At supper, the family ate carefully, as if utensils might complain. The girl learned to lift the spoon without her hand heating the handle, learned to wrap cloth around the cup even when the tea needed no protection from the cold. These accommodations became their own sort of faith. If we set this here, nothing will tilt. If we breathe this slowly, nothing will curl. If we make no sudden movements, the house will continue pretending to be a house. Word traveled, in the way it always does, by mistake and then on purpose. A clerk's wife repeated something she had been told in confidence to a laundress she trusted, and trust is simply a slower form of telling. Soon a woman the family did not know stood outside the pale door with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth, and when the mother opened the door, a crack. The woman cried for a child who had died of a fever in spring, and asked if this girl could stand near her and warm the room where grief had cooled everything. The mother did not answer. She simply loosened her fingers on the door and let it shut itself. It did so sound less lie, in the narrow space between day and evening. A carriage sometimes slowed near the house, and then continued as if it had only forgotten its route for a moment. Men inside tipped their hats forward and spoke through smoke, and one of them wrote a letter to someone in a city farther east, whose seal, when cracked, would leave a red fleck on a desk blotter like a small wound. The letter described a phenomenon and promised a witness worth paying for. It included the words inexplicable and observation, because those words build steady bridges between curiosity and intrusion. If there was a beginning to what followed, it was not a bang or a cry or an overturned chair, but a quiet agreement between the city and the story. The city decided to look, and the story decided to let itself be seen. The girl woke one morning with the feeling that the air had leaned in during the night and whispered its intention into her ear. There was no pain. There was a clarity, as bright and sterile as a snowfield, the kind that makes you squint even with your eyes shut. She rose and dressed and stood at the window, and the gas lamp outside flickered once and steadied itself, as if bracing. Somewhere, water boiled. Somewhere else, a match failed to catch, then did. In the bakery, a hand hovered above an oven's mouth a moment longer than it should have, reassured by what it found there. On the street, A boy stopped, mid-run turned, and stared at the pale door. Not in fear, but in patience, as if at last, something was about to arrive, for which his waiting had been practice all along. Winter receded slowly, like a guest, unsure if they'd overstayed. The German quarter throbbed with thawing pipes and anxious footsteps, and yet the stretch of road near the Richter home remained unnervingly unchanged. The frost melted everywhere but the bricks outside the pale door, where a rim of icy residue held on with curious loyalty. It was about this time that the men with notebooks returned, not family doctors or priests, but strangers with polished boots and prescripted politeness. Their names shifted depending on the hallway they entered. Some claimed medicine, others science. A few didn't bother to pretend. The first asked to inspect her pupils. The second requested her to speak a phrase in German, Latin, then silence. The third was more interested in the temperature of her breath against a silver spoon. Each left with notes they didn't share, and theories they never dared publish. The house accumulated questions, the way old attics accumulate dust, thickly, passively, without agreement. The neighbors whispered that these visits stirred the air wrong, as though the girl was being undone, one hypothesis at a time. Some of the men returned in pairs, arguing in hushed tones as they stepped over the threshold. They brought machine-style heavy devices that hummed and flickered in ways no one understood, even the operators. One man offered coin for an overnight stay in the parlor. The father declined. Another asked if the girl would visit a laboratory 2 districts away. The mother declined, and so their curiosity lingered outside, like a mist, refusing to burn off Emma's condition. Whatever it was, seemed to shift subtly, as though the attention itself sculpted her nature. Her eyes stayed steady longer. Her fingers left prints on brass that took hours to cool. A priest, not the first, but a visiting one from a nearby convent, watched her cradle a candle, the flame bowing inward, not outward, and whispered that he had seen something similar only once, in Sicily, and then never again. He did not sleep that night. He left before breakfast. Rumors hardened into legend. The Ember Child, some called her, though never to her face. "She's the warmth that doesn't comfort," whispered an old widow on her way to St. Mary's. Parents discouraged their children from asking. Children didn't listen. Emma became the subject of drawings, poorly rendered in charcoal behind schoolhouses. In one sketch, her face was absent, just heat lines where the eyes should be. Inside the house, the family grew quiet. Meals became shorter, sleep irregular. The girl's mother took to opening the windows at dusk, even in the chill, as if inviting the cold to balance out whatever the girl might emit. The father began whittling wood again, not for utility, but rhythm. The controlled scraping of blade against grain as a kind of prayer. And then came a man who didn't claim science or healing. He claimed stories. He was tall, wore gloves in spring, and spoke slowly, carefully. "I do not come with questions," he told them, "only ears." They let him in. He sat across from Emma in the parlor while the candle flickered between them, flame listing always toward her. He asked nothing. He simply waited. The next day, he returned with ink and parchment, not for recording her answers, but her presence. He drew her not in realism, but essence. Curves of warmth where bone might be, swirls of breath that defied anatomy. And beneath each sketch, a sentence. Some things explained themselves when given silence. He left the drawings behind. Later, someone tried to publish them. The printing press refused. Pages curled unexpectedly. One burst into flame without source. The sketches were stored, sealed, and eventually lost. This was the season the city almost believed. Science had no answer. Faith had grown timid. But art was close. Emma began to change in ways too nuanced for science, and too intimate for folklore. Her footsteps no longer echoed the same way on the floorboards. The warmth that once radiated from her skin, sharpened, precise, deliberate, like the edge of sunlight slipping through cathedral glass. Her gaze softened, yet held more gravity. Even the air around her grew watchful. Her mother noticed first, folding sheets that cooled unevenly, with corners still warm long after touch had left them. Her father, silent and practical, began carrying a bucket of water each morning, not to use, only to have nearby. At night, he laid a poker across the threshold. Metal spoke in hushes, no one heard but him. Emma took longer pauses at the window. She began to whisper to the shadows, not in words, but with something older, like breath remembering its source. The priest from St. Mary's returned, not with scripture, but with salt. He sprinkled it in quiet lines under the window panes and offered no blessing. When he left, he stepped backward, just once. The second floor of the house grew warmer. Clocks lagged behind, without explanation. A neighbor's dog refused to pass the gate, barking only once before retreating with its tail low. The postman, always punctual, began dropping the mail from a safe distance. Letters arrived, scorched at the edges. Children no longer dared each other. Now they watched quiet, reverent, as Emma moved past the curtains, her outline both human and not. A boy wrote her name on a slate and left it on the windowsill. It disappeared by morning. In its place was a single white feather. Still warm, then came the dreams. Several families reported visions of fire contained, elegant, moving not to consume, but to judge. The dreams varied, yet all spoke of Emma standing at the center of a flame that did not burn, but beckoned. One woman claimed Emma asked her a question in the dream. She couldn't remember the words, only that the answer mattered. A visiting scholar recorded temperatures along the block. He mapped strange heat trails, symmetrical, undisturbed by wind. One ran straight from Emma's window to the bakery oven, which, that morning, failed to heat, despite stoking. The baker blamed the logs, but they splintered with the sound of dry bone. The girl herself said little. She began sketching circles and small ones on the sill, larger ones behind her bedroom door. None were erased, and yet the family remained not terrified, only altered. They no longer asked why but when, as if change had entered the room, shaken hands, and stayed. In late March, the house flickered. That's the only way to describe it. Neighbors reported seeing it shimmer not visually, but sensorially, like sound in the bones. The air trembled, gas lamps dimmed across the street. One man dropped a glass, claiming his fingers went briefly numb. A dog cried once and went silent. And, in that trembling, Emma walked outside. She stood under the street lamp, eyes lifted, arms low. The flame curved slightly toward her, then stilled. Her breath formed no cloud. A child across the road whispered, "She's not cold," and his mother closed the shutters without looking. That night, the priest wrote in his journal, "She has chosen." The day after Emma stood beneath the street lamp, nothing returned to normal. It was not panic that spread. There was no screaming, no broken windows, no officials dispatched. Instead, an awareness settled over the German quarter like an invisible ink finally activated. Everyone could see that something had changed, but no one dared name it aloud. The baker's firewood smoked, but did not burn well. Candles flickered low and without scent. Church bells echoed with a strange reverberation, as if ringing through thicker air. And the Richter home, once murmured about in private, now occupied dreams and waking thoughts in equal measure. Emma's mother began journaling, not a habit of hers before but now. Each morning, she scratched lines into a cloth-bound notebook. Not sentences, just impressions. Stillness in the north room. Cat blinked twice, did not move. Shadows did not follow sun. Her handwriting frayed like fabric, left too long in heat. Pages curled at the edges even in dry weather. Emma herself grew quieter. She no longer whispered to shadows, but to absence itself, shaping breaths with her mouth as if speaking to something that predated sound. Her drawings became more precise, overlapping circles, interlocking spirals, lines that refused smudging. They weren't symbols in any known language, but people who saw them felt as if they should mean something, like memories you've never had. Visitors still came, but not as investigators. Now they arrived as seekers, clergy, poets, mothers, who had lost children. They stood on the stoop, not knocking, waiting instead for the door to open on its own. Sometimes it did. Emma would stand just inside, say nothing, and look until the person began to cry. She never touched them, but they left changed, calmer, quieted, or shaken, as if something unacknowledged had finally nodded back. One man, blind, in one eye, claimed he saw with it again after seeing Emma. He refused to speak further and left for Canada the next morning. A girl from the next street was found sleepwalking, barefooted in the snow, standing motionless outside the pale door. She said the house was warm like a dream, not hers. At dusk, the house hummed, not a sound, but a resonance. Birds avoided the eaves. Rats moved their burrows 2 blocks east. The wind bent differently there, and smoke from chimneys avoided drifting toward it, even when the air was still. Then came the photographs, or rather, the attempts. Several men brought cameras, all failed. Plates melted, images blurred, one lens cracked in silence. But a single photo, accidental, uncomposed, was kept. It showed only the pale door, but the light surrounding it formed an impossible glow, like morning sun forged by memory. The photographer refused to look at it again. He locked the negative in a box and buried it beneath his barn. The house remained unchanged outside, but inside, rooms were subtly larger, ceilings farther away. Visitors reported different spatial feelings. Someone claimed the hallway grew longer after they blinked. Another said the fireplace receded when he looked away. Time there wasn't wrong, just uncommitted, like a dancer unsure of rhythm. Emma no longer slept fully. She entered a kind of resting awareness, eyes closed, but not unaware. Her mother sat with her some nights, holding her hand not out of worry, but reverence. Her father lit small coals in a dish and watched the embers respond, not flaring, but inching toward her in spirals. He whispered his childhood prayers, then began whispering in a tongue he'd forgotten he knew. One day, the house did something no house should. It sighed. It came at noon, soft and unmistakable. Neighbors paused mid-step. Someone dropped a bucket. A newborn stopped crying. The sound was not wind, nor plumbing, nor tired boards. It was intentional, like a gesture made by something that finally exhaled, and Emma stood in the doorway, not just visible, but evident. She looked across the cobblestones, her gaze sweeping gently like fingers over piano keys. Her presence didn't demand silence, it created it. And in that quiet, the quarter realized something larger had arrived, not visiting, not fleeing, but staying. April arrived, but not as a thwarter, as an extension of the hush. The German quarter clung to its unease with a reverence born from exposure. Emma's presence had ceased to feel like rumor and settled into fact. Children stopped drawing her likeness. Now they folded paper into symbols that held no name but felt protective. Adults paused mid-sentence when her name hovered near, not from fear, but from recognition. The house itself continued to change, not visibly, but emotionally. Visitors described a sensation of being inside a memory too old for them to own. The stairs creaked, not from weight, but from anticipation. Mirrors misted on clear days. The parlor clock ticked slower, but kept the correct time, as if time itself had bowed to a different rhythm within those walls. Emma began writing, not letters, not diary entries, but brief lines on small slips of paper, sometimes in German, sometimes in a language no one could identify. These fragments were placed around the house, beneath cups, tucked into door frames, slid between the pages of unread books. Her mother read them silently, then stored them in a tin box lined with salt. Her father burned one, and the ash floated upward instead of falling. People stopped calling her strange. Instead, they called her listening, and it was true. Emma began to respond, not with words, but presence. When someone asked the house a question, sometimes Emma passed by. When a pain lingered, sometimes warmth entered the room in a low wave. A woman who miscarried stood on the stoop for an hour, and left with dry eyes and a heartbeat steadied. No one thanked Emma, but they stopped speaking poorly of her. The city stirred with new patterns. Lamps near the house burned longer. Fog parted gently around its walls. Even the rain adjusted course. One journalist attempted to record these phenomena. His pen fractured in two. The ink spilled in spirals. Rumors spread east and west. A scholar from Philadelphia wrote requesting an audience. He arrived with thermometers and faith in repeatable results. He left 2 days later, his notes scorched and his beliefs less certain. Another came from Progan, old woman with a crooked spine. She entered the house with difficulty and left, walking straight. Emma had stopped aging, not in appearance. Her face still changed, gently, seasonally, but in aura. People began describing her with words used for seasons and tides, not girls. She was less child than pattern. May brought the first firefly swarm to linger exclusively around her window, and then came the map. Her father, carving late one night, began shaping a piece of wood with unfamiliar instinct. When finished, it resembled no known geography, but when held near Emma, the wood pulsed faintly. A visitor claimed it resembled a dream he once had of a place with no entrance, only recognition. Emma touched the carving, and the floor warmed beneath it. They hung it above the fireplace. It was then the house began to speak subtly, creaks that answered footfalls, a hum when salt crossed the threshold. The wind inside moved differently than the wind outside. One woman claimed to hear music in the pipe slow, like a cello played underwater. Not all reactions were reverent. Some feared what Emma might mean. A man left a Bible on the doorstep, weighted with coal. Another chalked protective symbols on the street. Both gestures faded without event. The Bible lost pages without anyone touching it. The chalk dissolved overnight. Even in dry weather, Emma stood longer in the doorway now. Sometimes she faced east, toward something no one else could see. Her eyes held neither pain nor hope, only understanding. A boy asked her if she knew the future. She blinked once. The boy ran home and slept through the next 2 days. Word drifted beyond Milwaukee. In Chicago, a historian claimed Emma matched descriptions from a 17th century Dutch journal. In Budapest, a teacher compared her sketches to ancient clay inscriptions. None reached conclusions. They simply added layers to her presence. Emma remained silent. But the silence now meant more. It became a language, shared between those who felt her and those who needed to. And slowly, the quarter began to shift, not outward, but inward, folding into itself like a story readying its last page. By June, Emma's name stopped being spoken, not out of disdain, but reverence, like a hymn so familiar, it no longer needed to be sung. The quarter grew quieter, not just in volume, but in intent. People walked slower. Children stopped playing in the street. Even the birds altered their migration patterns, looping gently around the Richter house as if honoring a landmark not made for flight. Inside, the house was not warmer. It was deeper. Rooms folded themselves, corners elongated, chairs remembered weight differently. Emma no longer occupied the space. She became part of its memory. Her footprints didn't fade, but pulsed faintly where dust should have settled. The floor whispered her name like an old friend unwilling to let go. She spoke now, occasionally, one word at a time. Always to no one, but never unheard. Her voice didn't break. Silence, it shaped it. And what she said was untranslatable. Linguists tried. Poets failed. A man who claimed to hear patterns in thunder thought he recognized a syllable in Emma's breath, but when he wrote it down, the ink evaporated. The word lingered in his throat for a week. changing the way he said good morning. The city turned inward. Local papers stopped printing her name, even in rumor. Churches folded her into prayer without explanation. One priest lit a candle each dusk for her, who bridges, and refused to elaborate. A teacher told her students that some chapters are remembered best without reading. Then came the forgetting. It wasn't sudden, not an illness or spell, just a quiet, unthreatening people. Passed her house without recognition. Stories stilled. The map her father carved lost its pulse. The tin box of paper fragments cooled. One by one, the drawings curled inward and became blank. Emma smiled. Once that it was not captured, it was felt, and the house sighed again. On the last day of June, someone knocked. No one answered, but the door opened anyway. Inside was emptiness, not abandonment, but transition. The walls held warmth without source. The air shimmered slightly. A single circle, etched faintly in the floor, pulsed once and faded. No one saw Emma leave, but a girl in Baltimore woke, with warm hands, and a language she didn't speak. A mother in Trieste placed salt at her doorstep, unsure why. A cat in Kyoto blinked at the dark, then purred with a sound it had never made. The echo continues. Emma was never declared missing. No report, no investigation, just a quiet transition. That didn't require validation. Her absence behaved like a new presence in scene, but wholly felt. The Richter house was never sold, never repurposed. It remained standing, untouched by time. Its door unopened, but somehow never truly closed. Yet far beyond Milwaukee, tremors began. A woman in Oslo woke to find her room gently radiant. Not sunlight, something finer. She spoke a word, she didn't. No. It warmed the teacup beside her. In Morocco, a child marked spirals in the sand, fingers glowing faintly, eyes unstartled. The drawings vanished by morning. A librarian in Quito discovered a book that hadn't existed the day before. Bates' pages blank, except for one line in German. She remembers where warmth belongs. The ink shimmered, then stilled. None of this was linked by science. But pattern recognizes its own, and Emma became pattern. Her story, no longer told with names, traveled as sensation, myth, almost instruction, a kind of spiritual geometry. Circles in frost, coals that cooled gently instead of sharply, rooms that seemed to breathe just once. When someone thoughtful walks through them, people forgot Emma Richter, but they remembered the warmth that never burned. The way certain houses feel deeper than their dimensions suggest. The calm that descends when silence means more than absence. She lived in those now, not haunting, not surviving, but echoing. In the slip between recognition and wonder. In every moment when someone turns toward a quiet corner of their world and feels something leaning back, not demanding, but offering. And in that offer, memory of a girl whose condition defied science, of a quarter that learned to listen, of fire that chose gentleness, and of stories not bound to voice, but to feeling. Emma Richter didn't vanish. She dispersed, and wherever warmth refused explanation, she remained. If Emma Richter's story stirred something in you, an unease, a flicker of recognition, a memory you can't place, then you've already stepped into the quiet legacy she left behind. These tales aren't just whispers from the past. They ask questions no theory can answer, and open doors to parts of ourselves we rarely visit. If you want more stories that refuse easy explanation, that live between shadow and warmth, you know what to do. Subscribe to Unseen Anthology, because some histories don't want resolution. They want to be remembered differently.